to our sessions. My name is Christoph Sauerbach. I am one of the directors of iCAAD. It's a great pleasure today to just introduce briefly this panel. And I was reflecting the crisis of credibility in addiction treatment and what constitutes credibility anyway. We believe at iCAAD that this huge gathering is also a great opportunity to pose and go through a bit of epistemology, a bit of self-introspection, and just try to check where we're at. And the world is changing fast. Research is just delivering every day new findings, new things. And we really felt it was important to address that topic here during those 3 days. So it's happening today. And it's happening with, I'm trying to find the right word, experts, paramount, great experts, knowledgeable people, all that together. So John Drummond is the Chief Executive of Nelson Trust. Abigail Cooper is the Director of Knowledge Management for Addiction. Tim Layton is the Director of Professional Education and Research at Action and Addiction. Could be better. I mean, we're in good hands today. And Noel is an extremely knowledgeable therapist and a great epistemologist of what we do. And I know that really from our conversation. So I don't know what to say, actually. I'm just thrilled. It's a great pleasure, and it's a really true honor to have such a quality of expert today. I think I'll leave it with you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Christoph. Welcome, everybody. My name's Noel McDermott, psychotherapist and care manager, I think. I'm going to claim that title this morning because my background was a lot in social services and delivering complex care packages, which I think is going to be some of the issues that we're going to be looking at, because we're dealing with people and the whole complexities of their lives. So, and we were talking just before about that, about what does this mean, credibility, what are outcomes. We've got a great panel this morning, really excited about the presentations you're going to get. Just a brief housekeeping stuff. If you do hear an alarm, it's not a drill, because there isn't one planned. So please go outside and meet at the meeting points, the fire exits at the back. The structure of this morning is going to be, we'll have a presentation from each person and with an ability to ask questions for them, each one on the presentation. And there may be some questions you have that can't be answered by the particular presenter, but can be answered by the panel. So we'll then have a panel session after all those presentations. So hopefully lots of opportunity to get some conversations going. It's a subject that's close to my heart, about looking at what are the outcomes, what is credibility, how do we measure treatment services, how do we look at the improvement in people's lives as well, and what are the measures we're using around that. And I'm going to place a personal note in there because it's important to me because I'm in recovery. So I have a personal commitment there to my own life. So I don't usually talk about that in public, but I think at this one I will. So I have a personal investment, and I have other people very close to me, members of my own family, who are not in recovery. So I do have a personal investment in that. I think it's okay this morning to do that, as well as a professional investment. Enough from me, and I say that because I think that may be true for quite a few people in the room. So I think that's all right to be open about that, or not. As Abby's going to present first, and she's been around a long time in a variety of fields, always around looking at quality management and management of services and delivery of services, while also managing to focus on people and the quality of services to the people that need them, the vulnerable patients or service users, whatever term that you prefer. And we had a great conversation about that before, so I'm really looking forward to your presentation. And without further ado, I'll let you just jump in there and get on with it if you like.
Okay. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I work for Addiction. I don't know if everyone knows Addiction, but just in case you don't, we're a national substance misuse and mental health charity. We have over 100 services. We're a national organisation, and this is our 50th year. This is our 50th anniversary this year. I haven't been with the organisation as long as many people. I've been there about 2 years now. I was with KCA before that. And I came, as Noel was saying, I came with background in kind of looking at services and looking at measurement, particularly in local authority. Because I was working in the local authority during the period of results-based accountability, which some of you may or may not know about, but I was working there during a time where there's a real focus on being accountable for making a difference and really trying to think about why we're here, what are we doing, what should we be achieving, and being able to demonstrate that we're making a difference. And at the time, lots of us were sent off on courses to learn about research-based accountability, and it's an American academic now, Mark Friedman, who sort of set this out and set us all on this course of making sure that we were doing what we should be doing and doing the things that are important. And one of the things that's really interesting about it is it made us think about how well we were doing things, kind of how much of things we were doing, how well we were doing it, was anybody better off? And if anyone was better off, what percentage of people were better off? Because sometimes you can do something that's great, but for a very small number of people. So that was, that we were all very fired up by this. It seemed like a good approach. It was also quite, Friedman wasn't quite sure about research. He felt that sometimes research could slow things down, and what you needed to be thinking about was really what made a difference. How are you going to measure it? There's definitely a focus on data, because the view was that lots of what we did was very complex, and you needed to be able to use data to evidence that, so you needed to be collecting data. So I moved from the world of local authority to work for AdAction, thinking results-based accountability, it'll be very straightforward. We'll look at what we're going to do, we'll be able to measure it, we'll just translate it, it'll be fine. Some of that's true, but it's not completely true. So what I really want to focus on this morning is the second part of the question, really, so the complexity. The credibility side of it, because I think I can't answer the question. I don't have a definitive answer to whether we're in crisis or not, but I think we can talk about credibility and what's happening around credibility. And one of the mantras of results-based accountability was trying hard isn't good enough. And I think, whilst that sounds very harsh, I think there's something about that is important to think about. You can work really very hard, you can be really trying your best, but if you're not helping people and you're not getting the outcomes that you need to get, then you probably need to think about that and have a look at whether you should be doing things differently. However, that's not that simple. When you're delivering really, really complex services and you're working with people who've got very, very complex needs, you can't just easily measure things. You can't just easily translate something that is very clear and straightforward straight over into another way of working. So one of the things that we've been looking at and thinking about quite a lot is some of the challenges that we face in relation to this complexity and how we respond to complexity, but also how we try and have evidence-based practice and use evidence-based practice, and how we try and ensure that we use research. There are a couple of things that I just wanted to mention that I think are challenges for us in relation to that. And one of those is that inevitably what gets measured gets managed, and we all understand that. However, we don't always have a choice in what gets measured, and we don't always have a say in what gets measured. And sometimes the way that something is measured at the far end of somebody's journey misses out lots of other things that have happened in between that are really important. So I think we just sort of need to be mindful of that. And I'm going to talk about an example that shows where that happened for us, where we had these kind of outcome measures, but we missed some things along the way. Also, not everything that matters can be measured. I think we all know that. I am a great believer in measurement, and I do like to try and measure things, and I do like to have an evidence base, but there are just some things it's very, very difficult to measure, and often they're the things that are very important to the people that we're working with, so it's kind of holding on to that. The other issue for me about research and an evidence base is that it changes all the time, and I think if you're in the front line and you're a practitioner, it can be really hard that something you were told 5 years ago was absolutely the right way to do something and the right way of working. 5 years later, it's not anymore. And so a lot of sort of putting evidence into practice is about unlearning. It's not just about asking people to do something new. It's about saying that thing we asked you to do before doesn't seem to be the way to do things now, and I think that's quite challenging and that's quite difficult. So that's some of the problems. So one of the things that we have tried to do is be methodical, really, in our approach. So we do want to be evidence-based, and we do want to be looking at effectiveness. And there are lots of different ways of getting evidence. There's lots of information that we can be gathering, and we've worked in various ways to improve our data, to look at our data, to interrogate our data. Done lots of work around that. We've also been very fortunate, as I'm sure many other organisations have, to have had some fairly big long-term research projects that have been quite rigorous in their approach. So have tried to work in a kind of pure way, although obviously we're not working in a research lab, we've tried to do that. And we then tried to use that evidence, and we've tried to look at how we use it, and we've tried to make changes in services consequently. And I just wanted to talk to you about one of those projects that we undertook, which was family work. And it's an interesting project because it's been running for about 10 years. And we recently went back to people who'd been involved over the course of the project, some of whom had stayed with it and some of whom hadn't, to get a sense of kind of what happened with that project. And when we went through the project, we had outcomes, we used outcome tools, we tried to make it very specific, and we tried to work in a very regulated way. And a short time into that project, we started to talk to some of the people who were using the services, and they were pretty clear with us that some of the things that we wanted to measure, like reduction in substance use, like mental health, improvement in mental health, like parenting efficacy, were kind of important to them, but actually they were also really, really bothered about, am I getting my children to school on time? Is their behaviour easier for me to manage now, or for us to manage as a group? So there were, and also are our family relations improving? So then we started to measure that. So we brought that into the project, and we started to measure those things. Now, some people stayed with the project, and some people were kind of a revolving door and went in and out, which, if you think about the way we're measured, is often seen as being kind of negative. If people are not staying with the service, that potentially there's an issue or there's a problem. So we went back to a group of people, 10 years, and some people who hadn't stayed through the project. And we talked to them, we did interviews with them about what they'd found. And the really interesting thing was, even those people who maybe would have, by sort of a firm measure, would have been seen to have not been successful, were saying this work and my involvement in this work really impacted on my life and the way that things are with my children now, and found that their improvement, they felt that they had their lives had improved more than they might have done. So for me, that's really interesting, because even when we tried to use kind of measures, it was formal measures, it was difficult. We had to negotiate and change them. But also, some of the ways that we might have been measured wouldn't have shown some of the benefits that had come from people being involved in that project. So I just sort of wanted to flag that to say, although we try and be very methodical and we try and work through things and we try and do things in particular ways, there's something which is slightly intangible kind of about what we do and the way that we work, which is very important as well. That said, we do try and get lots of evidence, and we do try and look at things, and we do collect various pieces of work, and we do look at it, and we end up often with a lot of information, really a lot of information. We try really hard not to think about what to do with it later, although probably sometimes if you're working for our services, it might feel that you've waited a long time to know what to do with it, but we try to use things as quickly as possible. And for me, there's something about this which is quite challenging, because even when you've got the evidence, and even when you think you've got evidence, or you've got data and you think you know what to do, or you've got the latest research or the most recent research, there's something really important about how do you put that into practice. You can't, it doesn't just happen. You need to be thinking about, because in terms of efficacy of research, what works in one environment isn't necessarily going to be effective in another environment. And I think that's one of the things that we're thinking about a lot, is kind of what will be effective for us and the ways that we work. We're commissioned in slightly different ways, our staff have slightly different skills. We can't necessarily just pick up something that's kind of pure and move it somewhere and adopt it in that way. So we've also been thinking about how do you do that, potentially that unlearning, but also what do you need to do to make research or evidence or whatever seem credible. And there's quite a lot of academic research about, if you want people to feel that they can take on new research or they can take on new ways of working. You have to give people time, and you also have to talk to them about what it means, and if it doesn't fit in their environment and it doesn't seem to work in that environment, you have to have that negotiation and you have to have that conversation. Because there are different types of learning. There's different types of evidence. There's obviously the evidence that comes from data and the evidence that comes from research. There's kind of theoretical evidence, but there's also experiential evidence, which is really, really important. And it's about trying to, when you're rolling things out across the organisation, when we're trying to use an evidence base, when we're trying to make sure that we're thinking about our credibility, you have to find a way of encapsulating all three of those types of knowledge or that type of evidence. So I'm not now going to give you an answer as to how to do that, but I'm just saying that we're thinking about how you do that and recognising that you need to think about how to do that quite carefully. But I use this slide quite a lot, and I kind of look at it myself quite a lot, because one of the other things about the way that we work is when we've tried to do some of the specific projects that have required outcome tools and lots of evidence gathering, that has implications for people who are working on the ground, because they're collecting that evidence, they're collecting those research findings, and outcome tools that are used properly should be part of a therapeutic intervention, and they should be really helpful and they should assist. But if you're working and you're feeling pressured and you're busy and nobody's explained the value of this and there's no feedback from what you've collected, it doesn't always feel like that. So when we are asking people to be part of collecting evidence or talking to clients and getting more information from them, we're really mindful of that. And also that if you've come to us for a particular service and then we're asking you lots of questions about things that don't necessarily seem relevant, we need to be very clear about what we're doing and why we're asking those questions and how we want to use that information to benefit the person we're asking the questions of, not just the organisation at another kind of level. So, I think kind of in summary what I would say is that what we would like to be able to say is that everything we do works. That would be great if we could say that. Or everything we do informs an evidence base positively. But we know that whilst we want to be credible, we also have to be very realistic, and there are challenges with that. So there are barriers, understanding individuals' journeys. We want to help people sustain long-term outcomes or long-term benefits or to their lives just to be better, and that's quite individual. You can't just lump people together. So we have to be mindful of that, and we have to be working with that. We've talked a little bit about if we're going to do this kind of monitoring and measuring and talking about evidence base, we need to be feeding that back to people. We need to be trying to enable people to use these findings in their work and kind of constantly feeding that back, and that's not always easy because it's not the most important thing on a day-to-day basis for people. We've talked a little bit about the outcome measurements into practice. We also have iCAAD services, so I don't know if people know iCAAD services, but increasing access to psychological therapies, and they work in a they use outcome tools absolutely all the time. In every meeting, people kind of measure and say how they're doing, and we use those a lot. But it's a very different kind of service, and it's quite short, and people work with us for very specific periods of time. And that's true of some of our substance misuse people who use our services, but not all. There are some people who've been with treatment services quite a long time. So it's a different client group when you're thinking about outcome measurement. There's also something about the evidence that we collect and the information that we get. We tend to think about how we use it in practice, but I think one of the tricks we sometimes miss is that we can use it strategically and we can use it to influence policy. So sometimes being able to demonstrate what doesn't really work for you, even though you might not be able to change it at that moment in time because you're commissioned in a certain way or you're providing services in a certain way, you can potentially use that to inform the bigger picture really around what works and what might not work. And I think we probably need to be brave about doing that as well. And then the last point on there is just about the unlearning thing again. Really, it's helping people. People bring a lot of experience to their work, and it's about working in a way that acknowledges that and recognises that and supports that, whilst potentially also saying, but we need to do things a little bit differently. So from our perspective, the kind of potential enablers, and that's a very research-based accountability word, but the potential enablers to us looking at credibility and looking at how we can demonstrate what we're doing have been using outcome tools. We have found that beneficial, and also it gives us a way of looking across different services, which is helpful. We've also been really lucky in that we've been able to have access to external researchers and kind of critical friends who tell you when you're going off in a direction, or kind of push you to try and stay with the way you said you were going to do something and focus on it, and at least encourage us to have kind of negotiation if we want to, if there's a particular model that we're looking at implementing or way of working and that's proving tricky for some reason. So that's been really helpful. And the other thing I think that's really important, which I've talked about a little bit already, is just ensuring that we, or as an organisation, if we want to kind of integrate research findings or evidence-based work, that we don't just expect it to happen, that we support people to kind of think about how it's going to work in reality, and also if there's training they need or they disagree with it or whatever, that we can have those conversations, we can have those discussions. So I'm sorry I didn't say yes or no about crisis and credibility, but I suppose I didn't really want to, because I think that, I think credibility is important, and I think we do have a responsibility to be credible, both to the people that we are working with, and also to people that, in our case, give us money to do the work. But I think there are lots of opportunities to do things differently and do things better if we're thinking about what does credibility really mean and what do we need to do to be credible.
Thanks very much, Abby.
Okay.
That was amazing. I can't think of a better way of starting this panel, actually. And I was pondering about our choice of. They said to me, "Well, what's the running order?" I said, "Oh, let's do it alphabetically, shall we?" And then that happened, which was, I think you've covered all the ground and have nicely introduced some of the further topics that are going to happen. I know what's coming next. You don't, and it's really introduced the topic, and some of the things that struck me, and I'm going to ask you to think of some questions for Abby, or to hold them to the end, but it would be good to get some thoughts or questions now. But one of the things that struck me was that, I come from another field and then moved into a sort of addiction work, and it was very much about evidence-based and that sort of, as a therapist, that sort of thing about manualised treatment services and all that sort of stuff, and which might be a swear word to some people still, but then how you as a practitioner, how one as a practitioner, as a human being, introduces this stuff to the person that you're working with that needs the service, and the belief in that is really important. I was just thinking about, I know about iCAAD. They always use the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7, for example, and so do I. And so do I in my practice. I just got trained into doing that as soon as somebody walks in, just measuring where they're at right now, and offering that as a human part of the service. And I think it was really good to hear you talk about that, about we need to understand why this stuff is important. If we understand why it's important, we can help our clients understand why it's important. So any thoughts or questions for Abby? It would be really good if you have, let's scan the room. Does anybody want to share something at this point? Anything from your own practice or your own? I've opened up the idea of personal experience as well by sharing mine. So anything from that? Okay, well, have a think about it, and have a think about, we've got some time at the end when there's going to be a round robin panel discussion. So if you made any notes and you're processing that fantastic talk, it'd be really good to get some thoughts from you at the end. Okay, so Tim, you're next, aren't you? Yes. So I'm going to get the slides up for you and told where they are.
Okay. You don't have to talk to mine, it's okay.
Right. It's John's. Here we go. Yes, thank you very much. A couple of things I took from Abby's talk, particularly with the idea of complexity. It's okay, don't worry, I'll wait for my slides. And also the idea that there is a contextual thing to whether something works. Social interventions work in one place and they don't work in another, and you can randomise control trial them in one place and you can see that maybe they're effective, and then they get transferred somewhere else and it doesn't work. And the people who really get to grips with this. I think Ray Pawson and Nick Tilley in Realistic Evaluation, and if you don't know that, I don't know if you do, but it's the idea that, and theory-based evaluation by Carol Rice and things like that. Anyway, I'm going to kind of put the magnifying glass a little bit closer into the practice, and I'm going to talk a lot about counsellors. And it's an accident that they're called counsellors. It's an accident that anyone's called a counsellor. When Carl Rogers was developing his way of dealing with people, he was a psychologist, and in the United States at that time, particularly I think he was working in Chicago, but wherever he was, it was not legal to offer psychotherapy unless you were a medical practitioner. So you had to think of something else to call it. And you know, the term counselling as a practice just arose because he needed another name for it. And if one thinks about the uses of just the word counsellor in the United States, there's school counsellors, there's camp counsellors, there's this kind of counsellor and that kind of counsellor, and really this is a very varied phenomenon. And the fact that there are people working in addiction treatment programs called counsellors is a kind of semantic accident. And the reason why I start there is because I happen to think that working with addiction is one of the most challenging and complex types of practice that one could imagine. You've got people with highly complex problems. I mean, even the easy ones have got highly complex problems. There's problems in all kinds of domains. And you compare that with the old, you know, okay, there's a guy who's facing retirement and he's anxious and he doesn't know what he's going to do with himself and his marriages, and go and see a counsellor and work with that counsellor on a weekly basis for 2 years. You know, that's a different kind of thing from somebody who's in massive life crisis, the family's in shambles, there's legal problems, there's health problems, there's, you know, the whole lot, and we're supposed to pick this up and intervene in some way. And there's all kinds of points on the journey. We can help people before they've even considered perhaps something like abstinence. We can help people at the point where they are considering that. We can help people who are to achieve that. We can help people along the line to consolidate their recoveries. We might want to think about the family members, the employers. I mean, the complexity is enormous. I just want to give you a couple of quotes. I mean, because for me, I certainly would not want to undermine the idea that evidence-based practice is a good thing, but in a way it's a cultural phenomenon. This is, you know, there are pressures on us that require us to be evidence-based, and they're not necessarily in the best interests of the beneficiaries. So there's a very well-known therapeutic community in America called Samaritan Daytop. It used to be two things, but it's now Samaritan Daytop Village. And on the website it says, "We are focused on the validation of outcomes, using evidence-based practices to set in motion and maintain recovery for substance and abuse and dependence, and that trained to use state-of-the-art science-based approaches to treatment, the Samaritan Daytop Village staff combines its compassion and intuition with proven methods necessary for healing and recovery." Now that's on the website now. 20 years ago, you would not have seen anything like that. You know, and most likely the staff at Samaritan Village would not have been receiving training in these evidence-based models at all. And in fact, the intuition and the compassion would have been the thing. Now why? Because, well, as Barlow explains, the evolving criteria for reimbursement by insurers in the United States were to be based on evidence for effectiveness. So suddenly in comes this idea that we're not paying for it unless you can demonstrate something. Okay, so that's one thing. Hazelden is a very well-known archetypal Minnesota model treatment center, and they offer a Master of Arts in addictions counselling, and there's a brochure, and I took a look at this brochure, and on it is a testimonial quotation, and it's very telling. It says, "It's really useful to go to class and listen to a good lecture about, say, cognitive behavioural approaches, and then you go to your unit and put it into practice." Well, that's it. You know, there you've got a cognitive behavioural practitioner in half an hour. Now, if you look at John Morgenstern, who's a researcher practitioner who's interested in the dissemination of evidence-based practice into real-world situations, he found that it was possible to train counsellors in cognitive behavioural therapy to an adequate standard. What did they get? They received around 100 hours of didactic and clinical training, including supervision from doctoral-level clinical psychologists over a 5-month period. These people were already trained, qualified counsellors. That got them to a point where their practice could be considered adequate. It's a little bit of a different, there's a contrast there between going to a lecture and putting it into practice and having 100 hours of didactic and clinical training and then ending up sort of okay with this model. I mean, what I'm going to argue is that this is not the fault of the practitioners, but that the standards in our field are very low. And so I realise you probably can't read that, so I'm going to read it to you. I need to. This was this Kathleen Carroll and Bruce it's Bruce Ransford, are well-known researchers. They were involved in Project Match. They're extremely well-known, and they're very interested in how behavioural, evidence-based, research-based interventions get transferred into. Now, this bit is all about the dominant current strategy for training clinicians in the United States is through brief workshops offered through federally supported addiction technology transfer centres. And this paragraph goes on, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically there is increasing pressure on agencies and clinics to state that they offer evidence-supported therapies and some incentives for clinicians to be exposed to them, but no system of standards for ensuring that empirically supported behavioural therapies are delivered with even minimal levels of adherence or competence. This is generally the approach used currently, where trainees are exposed to a few basic skills in their formal didactic training, and then they learn specific techniques in their clinical practice. The available evidence also suggests that this approach is resulting in very little actual use of ESTs in practice. For example, in our CBT training study, although the clinicians claimed comparatively high levels of familiarity, the pre-training CBT adherence and competence was strikingly low. So, okay, they're saying that people are not getting the right kind of training. They're tending to get bits and pieces, brief workshops and that sort of thing. Now, in the discussion that came out of this paper, whoops, that's the wrong way, Bill Miller from New Mexico, the guy who kind of invented motivational interviewing along with a few other people, is saying what is actually being done in most addiction treatment programs. The truth is that no one really knows, including the administrators and supervisors of those programs. One thing I've learned in 4 decades of treatment outcome research is that what therapists actually do behind closed doors, even with specific training and with video and audio tape recorders running, often bears surprisingly little resemblance to what they say and believe they are doing. Self-reported skill in a specific treatment method is best related modestly to actual behavioural proficiency, and so on. And he says, similarly, therapist training needs to come out of the closet. Training by reading books, watching videotapes and attending workshops usually has little or no impact on actual practice. And there's a whole raft of research literature to demonstrate this. And then he says, okay, so what, I need to go around and not trip over some wires. What will we find when we open the closet? Now, they did a multi-site, massive research project, and they wanted to know what is ordinary counselling going. And so they listened to ordinary American addiction counsellors doing their addictions counselling. And they listened to 400 hours of this stuff. 400 audio tapes from the treatment as usual condition from 2 multi-site effectiveness studies conducted as part of the clinical trials network interventions associated with empirically supported therapies. Interventions associated with empirically supported therapies were essentially so rare as to be undetectable. So in 400 hours, there's no evidence at all that anybody's doing anything evidence-based. And moreover, even interventions that common sense would dictate be part of good clinical practice, such as case management, discussion of treatment goals, were present at surprisingly low levels. Now, I know this to be true. I used to run a postgrad diploma in addictions counselling. People had to submit audio tapes. And they were even asked to place the start of the tape. It was a cassette, the old style cassette. They had to place the beginning of the cassette at a bit that they thought was particularly interesting and showed off their skills. I used to listen to these tapes and I used to think, well, there's no relationship between what I'm listening to and what is being claimed. Somebody put this tape, they had a label on it saying relapse prevention. So this is an example of my work doing relapse prevention. And you put it at this point, and I started to listen, no relapse prevention going on. So I thought I'd listen to the entire session. There wasn't a single shred of anything in the entire session that had anything to do with relapse prevention at all. And that was a rather egregious example. But on the whole, again, the standards were deplorable. And it's because it's all behind closed doors. Nobody is looking and listening and monitoring and challenging and teaching and leading and demonstrating the skills that are needed to really become competent, to become a master of what John, I think, is going to call a craft, which is what it is. It's not a technology, it's a craft. It's not the fault of the counsellors. They are receiving inadequate training. There's not enough, there's not realisation that to work with addiction requires investment, requires an enormous amount of serious clout, money, time. There's inconsistent supervision. My undergraduate students do research projects. One of them researched the supervision that my students were receiving in their placements. That was the first year. Her second year project was on this, and the third year was on the supervisors themselves. She found out that the range of the quality of supervision ranged from the quite good to the absolutely appalling, in the sense that it was punitive, it wasn't helpful, the supervisor clearly didn't know what they were doing. And when she did the following year a project on which she talked to the supervisors, people had been plonked into the supervisor position without any preparation, training, or anything like that. They didn't want to do supervision, and in fact, the reasons often why supervision was cancelled, which it often was not because people didn't turn up, but because the supervisor wanted to dodge it. So again, there isn't really and there are no clear models. I mean, I bet you, if I go to an average treatment centre in this country and say to the council, what is your model of group psychotherapy here? People won't know. They won't have a model. Or they will have a model and I'll say, show me how that works. And it has nothing to do with what the model is purported to be. So, we need these things. So here is a free document. It was produced by the NIH in one of their iterations, and it is a set of addiction counselling competencies. And my feeling is that in a way, I'm a psychotherapist. I value psychotherapy. I admire counsellors. But to be honest, counselling training and psychotherapy training does not equip one to work with addictions. And the sort of ability to relate is essential. But then you've got to work with things that are people in crisis, people who've got a time-limited frame, you've got all kinds of stuff to deal with, you've got to think about the stages in recovery, you've got to think about all that complexity. And it's a profession in its own right, and it has been in the United States, even though, as we've seen, at the coalface, the standards just might not be that great. I recommend that anybody involved in training addictions counsellors downloads this and has a look at it. There's also, and so you've got just the 8 practice dimensions of addictions counselling. We're talking about clinical evaluation, the ability to screen, to assess, to treatment plan, to make referrals, to coordinate one's service, to implement a treatment plan. Just the counselling bit, individual counselling, group counselling, family, couples and significant others counselling. These are fundamental competencies that people need to be properly trained in, not just dumped into an environment and assume that they can get on with it. Client, family and community education, the ability to make records and document one's practice, professional and ethical responsibilities. And it comes with a companion document that nobody's ever read or seen or heard of, called TAP 21A, which is all about supervision, the supervision of substance abuse treatment. And again, it's talking about, I just happened to cut and paste the bit about critical thinking. One of the things about supervision is that one needs to have an ability to think critically and to transfer that critical thinking to one's practice. I could go on, but in a way, we need to take this a lot more seriously. We need to provide much better support. We need to provide much more serious training for people to do work that is essentially extremely difficult and complex and challenging and shifting and changes from year to year, and not in a progressive way. I mean, one particular bug there is the impact of neuroscience on our field, which for me is the phrenology of our age. And we're very interested in brains, and there are 3 trillion neuronal connections in the human brain, and we just don't really understand that level of complexity. What we do get are pictures, brain scans, and as somebody once said, a brain scan is a very quick solvent of critical faculties. We assume that this means something, and it's beginning to impact on, that we ought to somehow introduce neuroscience into our treatment programs. I'm not knocking the fact that neuroscience is incredibly interesting, but fundamentally I think addiction is a social phenomenon. It hasn't, rats get addicted in a different way. Humans get addicted in a social and cultural context, and in my opinion the solutions, as we can see, the most potent chemical that has dependency potential in terms of the percentage of people who get dependent on it is nicotine. In the 1950s, 75% of the adult population of Britain smoked cigarettes. Now it's less than 20%, I believe. It's actually dropped below 20%. So somehow millions and millions of people have exited an addiction to a chemical that is powerfully addicting in the brain. It's doing all kinds of delivery of stuff in the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area and all of this stuff. And I dare say it's doing its stuff in the orbitofrontal cortex as well. Nevertheless, people are able to exit that addiction due to cultural factors, due to pricing, due to the idea of health awareness, the idea that it becomes culturally acceptable to smoke, it becomes very difficult to smoke. I remember being on aeroplanes in the 1970s, and the whole place was a complete fog of tobacco smoke. Cinemas were sort of, the image is the beam of the projector kind of cutting through the smoke that was in there. We forget about this. This is an addiction, and people were able to exit it. People can exit alcohol addiction and heroin addiction and gambling addiction and all of these things, provided the cultural and social resources are made available to them. So anyway, that's the sort of supplementary rant. Okay, so that's good. I think I've done my 20 minutes.
You can have a bit more time if you've still got more of a rant left in you. Please feel free to rant away. Thanks so much, Tim. That's great. So the format is to sort of think of some questions or contributions that you got for Tim. I mean, some things that were striking me was that, I'm a therapist, a psychotherapist. I've been doing this for a long time. And the point you made about sort of what's happening in addiction is pertinent. I mean, I don't ever think I can do what the client needs. It's much bigger than anything I can do in the room with them. Absolutely. It's always much bigger than that.
It's a little nudge.
And there's a real sort of fantasy that you can step into, I think, as a practitioner, thinking that you can solve this issue. I learnt that one, I suppose, a long time ago, working with people who've been victims of torture. And we would see it as pathological, this sort of almost magical belief that you can sort somebody else out when something like that has happened. And you can't.
Yeah.
And having some humility about that is fundamental to the possibility of that person ever getting well. Because if you step into that pathological fantasy that you're going to do something about this thing,
very important.
There's only a certain amount that you can do, I think. And you highlighted that to me sort of brilliantly in that talk. It wasn't a rant, it was energetic, and I enjoyed the energy. Thank you.
I hope it's positive, and I certainly don't want to point out deficiencies and not offer solutions. I think we just need to take this a lot more seriously.
Yeah, and the issue about the dynamic between needing evidence and why do we need evidence, and how the need for evidence can be sort of economically and politically hijacked for other people's purposes. I suppose as a practitioner I think about the need for evidence as something that will guide me in whether anything I'm doing is of any use whatsoever. And I need to know that in some way. I need to have some sort of... The word goals came to mind when you were talking. I mean, how much are people using goals in their work with their clients explicitly, saying, well, what is it we're trying to do?
Yeah.
Okay, I can do that with you, or I can't do that with you. And it's not illegitimate just because I can't do it. I'm wondering if other people have thoughts and questions that they want to add in for Tim, because I'll just talk forever. I mean, this is such a passionate, important subject to me, both on a personal and professional. Yes, please. What's your name? Sorry.
Bradley Riddell. I'm a private practitioner. Apologies, Tim.
Bradley Riddell.
Specialising in addiction.
Yes. I might repeat your question. Do I need to repeat it for the microphone or not?
I've got a mic here.
Okay, have you got a mic? If you wouldn't mind giving it to Bradley, that would be really helpful. Thanks. Do you mind having a mic?
No, that's fine.
Great, thanks for your help.
It's quite a brief question after all that theatre. I just wondered, Tim, what you think could be done about this, because in my experience, and I'm sure a lot of other counsellors, the BACP plays a big part in all our lives and in the ethics and the practices that we strive to follow to the best of our ability, accrediting courses, etc. But there seems to be quite a vacuum coming back from them after that. And it seems that they could be doing an awful lot more, and I'm sure you must have given this some thought, because we all pay our dues to them. That's quite a regular contribution, and I'm sure they must have a big pot of cash there. But
it's a good question. I'm going to answer it briefly because, again, I want to make time for John, but it's a really good question, which is I'm trying to talk to the BACP. I haven't actually started yet because it's actually difficult to know exactly who to talk to. But I would like BACP to set up an addictions counselling section. It might not be called that. It might want to go broader and look for the Centre for Counselling of Discombobulation of variety, various sorts. But the point is that if we had the recognition that this is a specialist area of counselling, that it requires particular knowledges, skills, and so on, and probably needs to include training in group therapy and managing therapeutic communities and things like that, then I don't know where I'm going to get with that, but the idea would be that we might be able to legitimate a training that includes some of the things that people need, and BACP would take an interest in it. Because at the moment my students go to BACP and they say, well, we're not going to accept that because that's addiction and it's not generic counselling. So yeah, I'm hoping to start negotiating with them at some point, and I will knock on the door and see who answers, and maybe other people will help me knock on the door as well. Yeah, so good question, thanks.
A proposal for a pressure group. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great idea. Any other questions? Could we get the microphone to you? Is that all right?
It's not a question, it's just that they do accept elements of it, because I done your course, Tim, as you know, and I got credited through using elements of my training with you, the group therapy, and they accepted elements of it to get my accreditation.
Yeah.
So it is useful.
It's great, but even the training. It's a fantastic foundation, and I believe in the degree that I designed. But it's not a clinical training, and I'm trying to offer some accessible, affordable 2-year clinical trainings in various things that that actually people will be able to manage in terms of cost, in terms of being able to get there. It'll be a blended learning courses. The academic bit, the demos, the lectures will be done on video. You can do that at home, and you come together and talk about how you're using this model over a 2-year period. I think that might improve things a little bit, because people just simply don't get that. It's like I was put into group at Cloud's House in the 80s and said, well, you're facilitating the group. I said, okay. What do I do? He said, well, you sit and wait until somebody says something, and then you think of something to say back. It was. Again, it was all right. Cloud's House was a great place, but there wasn't any training. And what I actually did after 2 years was I went to Hazelden and looked at their training and kind of imported it back, because I also realised there was a cultural gap there. You couldn't just put the Hazelden training into Britain. You had to modify it for the British culture and for the assumptions and the way that we operate. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, but I think, I'm going to try and sort out some things that might improve matters a little bit. There's no money in our field. The Americans fund this stuff federally. They've got NIDA and the NIAAA and so on, and they've got massive funding. They fund universities to do research. We don't. So.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think I see some energy in the room for that. So think about some questions and comments that you have around this subject when we go into the panel a bit later on. Thanks so much. Really enjoyed that. So, John, I'm going to hand over to you, and John's going to take the final slot, and we've saved the best till last, maybe. So you're all ready to go.
That's a bit of pressure. No. Actually, I was quite enthused by Abby's and Tim's presentation, almost to the point where I wanted to forget my own and just respond to that. I'm John Trolan. I'm the Chief Executive of an organisation called the Nelson Trust. We're based in the Cotswolds. The organisation has evolved and developed certainly over the 20 years that I've been part of it. Traditionally we were considered to be a provider of residential rehabilitation, treatment for people with drug and alcohol dependencies, which we still do. But that work has extended into the community now, where we work with a range of people with a range of social needs. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the part of my journey through that work. I was one of Tim's students, and what it didn't tell us on the brochure when we were, applying
Your
to do
tape
the
was
course
quite good, John.
was the entertainment we were going to get. What I know about my tape, was when I listened back to it, I could not understand a word I was saying because I had to transcribe this. And obviously the client was having a conversation with me, and I'm trying to figure out what did I say. I just couldn't. So I think that's how I did quite well on the tape bit. On the title for this presentation today originally came from a guy called Bob Lynn, he was a professor of addiction studies in Rutgers. He's been in the field for years. He's a great guy, and I've worked with him a number of times. But he had a triple bypass a couple of weeks ago. He's doing well now, and it's something very similar to Tim's sentiments. Bob's always been pushing for, show me that what you do works. Similar to what Abby was saying about, how do we measure, that what you're doing is effective. How do we measure what we manage, essentially, and continue to do it. And I've been on this journey where, I got into the addictions field about 20 years ago, when I went into what you needed then to be a counsellor was 3 years sobriety, in the addiction field, and,
that much.
And I thought, and really, I thought these guys were quite, some of them, were quite good at top, and I was quite impressed by them. But I realised as well, I needed to learn something. I did the postgrad course, and when I came back, the first thing I said was, anybody who works in this field needs to have who calls himself a counsellor, right, needs to have at the minimum a postgraduate diploma. Because in the process of doing it, what I realised was that there was lots of people getting kicked out of treatment. Pretty much the basic research we had then was the NDTMS stuff that said 3 things. Usual thing, millions spent, and it found out 3 things. You need a model, you need to retain a client in treatment, and you need to be able to form a therapeutic alliance with them, You can do those 3 things, you're on the right road. I went back to a treatment centre where people are getting choked out because they didn't have the right attitude. I was going to think, so there's a few of you here who've been choked out for not having the right attitude. Who were we there for? Who were we there to serve? So I felt quite passionate about that, and brought some influence to bear on that, and I wasn't alone, and we began to see the results of it. And I think in some respects, some of that was the science part of me was saying this needs to be evidence-based, The bit I was looking at was some of the art stuff, There were artists working in the field, right, who I was hugely impressed by, And, some of them were very, very good, but what I discovered was that they were illusionists, They were dazzlers, They were brilliantly entertaining, But when people asked the question, how did he do that? I don't know, Okay, some kind of a trick, and they moved on. And I remember looking at somebody I quite admired, working in a kind of a workshop environment, thinking, that is brilliant, absolutely brilliant the way he's done all that. And I turned around to a client and said to the client, didn't you like that? And he said, no, I found it very patronising, actually. And I thought, actually, he's the one we're here to listen to. He's the one we're here to listen to. But again, as Tim was saying earlier, this work isn't easy, And I went in with my manual, I did after the postgrad diploma, I went on and did a master's degree in King's College in London, And I don't usually disclose this, but it was hugely personal for me. We were based at Guy's Hospital, and the last time I'd been in Guy's Hospital, I'd been resuscitated from a cardiorespiratory arrest from being a bit greedy, actually, some substances. So going back in, to me, was just such an amazing kind of, experience. And I had the most fantastic time there, a great centre of learning. I loved going up there, loved my weekends there, doing all the stuff I did. So when I came back to work, I brought back the science, and I brought back the manual, And I went in and I met my first client who was diagnosed with, borderline personality disorder, And she destroyed me, Yeah, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing here. Yeah, and how do I tell anybody? Yeah, because after all that training and all that money, like, I'm rubbish. Yeah. So it was a bit, it was a bit of a journey. I told Tim actually. He said, "Don't worry, I am as well." But, no, he told me about supervision. Yeah, he said, never do this on your own. Yeah, okay, never do it on your own. And I suppose, I could see certainly, and the people I was working with could see the benefit of elements of both. Elements of art, elements of science. We need to be able to connect to the people that we work with, on a human way, in a relational way. The first question we ask them is, how can we help you? Yeah. What can we do for you? Yeah. And as Tim pointed out, we're a client group. It's not always that simple. Yeah. And that's straightforward. And it often changes. Yeah. And science changes as well, as Abby pointed out. Yeah. It's, it was really interesting actually. I'm around long enough for somebody to have come and said to me one time, it was a student, I don't blame her for that. And she said to me, I found this new way of working, which I think we should be all trained in. And I said, well, what's that? And she said, mindfulness. And I said, it's new. And she said, yeah. I said, it's been around for about 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Well, just because you'd heard it, before she'd come across it, yeah. Anyway, I've been around to see all those new things, yeah, and they come in and they go out of fashion, and as Abby said, sometimes they stay around long enough to influence policy, and people begin to practice it. I would suggest by then it's too late, yeah, by then it's too late. I have seen, our client group change, I don't see people coming into residential treatment now that I seen coming in 20 years ago, yeah, just don't see them, I'm hoping that they get everything that they need in the community. But they're not coming to us, that's probably a good thing actually. And I think as an organisation, I've got a group of people who want to be ahead of the curve. They want to be when the policy comes out, and the strategy comes out, they take great pride in saying, this is what we're doing now. Yeah, and before you write the next one, yeah, we'll be doing something different. We will have improved on it. Yeah. And that just doesn't happen by magic, yeah? That happens with investment, investment of time, resource, and money, yeah? And you have to be willing to change, you have to be willing to move on. And certainly, my experience of working in the field is that it's a bit like that. It's a bit like being part of a wave, yeah? And you've got to keep going with the momentum, both as an individual and as an organisation, yeah? Because once you stop, you just get in the way of the wave. Yeah, so if you can't keep going with it, you got to get out of the sea basically, yeah, and let others go with it too. And for me, that's been a kind of a remarkable journey. Seeing staff working with people now that I'm not skilled to work with, yeah, I couldn't have worked with the issues and the challenges that they bring, to our centres and our day centres and that. And I might touch on some of that actually before I finish, because what. I know the phrase whole systems approach is bandied around a lot, it's probably a bit like counselling, I think at the last count it was 400 different models of counselling, somewhere around that. So lots of people will use a whole systems approach phrase to describe a number of things. What I will say, a kind of a mini case study that I came across recently that put it into perspective for me and helped me to kind of understand it. We had a serious case review recently in Gloucestershire. I don't know if you know what a serious case review is, but something serious happens to a child. The chair of a children's safeguarding board says this needs to be investigated. This needs to be looked at. Yeah, and it was a 3-year-old boy who had his ribs fractured and his intestine perforated. Yeah, and his mum had been on a script for 6 years, yeah, and in the safeguarding review, what it said was it was kind of clear. It didn't say she was on for 6 years. What it did was it said what age she was when she started the script, yeah, and what she was doing at the time of the incident, which was 6 years later, and that was still reducing, yeah, after 6 years, yeah, okay, and then I looked at what she got, and what she got as part of the script was a script every 2 weeks, yeah, okay. She'd been on a script 3 years when the child was born, Her partner was a heroin addict with mental health problems. She was a victim of domestic abuse. Her mum looked after 2 of her older children, yeah. And my thing around this, what can I help you with this? And it's not about blaming anybody. It's not, because there's no one person responsible. It wasn't the agency who were providing the script. It wasn't the social workers who were working with the family. It wasn't the schools who came into contact with them. For me, the issue was systemic. Yeah, the system had stayed kind of stifled in this, and she needed to be treated differently. She needed to be treated in a way that took all those things into account. Yeah, and it's not like that there isn't a way. Yeah, and again, it's not me doing the work; it's staff who I have working for me, which is absolutely fantastic. Yeah, and I think the way that the kind of our organisation has kind of developed, I think, and certainly the way I like to see it, is that I've got frontline workers who are coming into contact with these people, yeah, and they're engaging them, they're forming the relationship with them, and they're turning around to the people behind them, the likes of me, saying, I would be able to do this better, yeah, if I had some trauma-informed training, if I had this, if I had that, if I had the other, and if we had these resources, we'd be more effective at this. And I see the job of everybody else who isn't in the front line, yeah, as being making sure they do their utmost to make that happen, because that's how we make a difference. And some of the research that they've been telling me about lately, and I've read it but I haven't studied it, is the adverse childhood experiences. I'm not sure if any of you have come across that. I mean, it's been, they've been doing prospective research for about 20 years in the States now, yeah. And it really touched me with this kid, because I thought, actually, when I look at his experiences, he can tick the boxes, yeah, he's going to be able to tick the 7 boxes that say you're 1,180 times more likely to become an injected heroin user. Yeah, 1,180 times. What do we do at this point? Do we give him our card and say, come back when you're 25 or 26? Yeah? If there is a crisis of credibility in the field, yeah, okay, it's our failure, yeah, to take that information into account and do something. Yeah, and I'm not saying that we have to do it on our own. I'm not saying that Nelson Trust have to do it, or Action on Addiction have to do it on their own, or AdAction have to do it on their own. But we have to have a conversation about how we manage that, and how we manage the needs of those individuals and do something different. Yeah, and I think some of the stuff that Abby touched on, yes, about measuring what we do and making sure that what we're doing is actually achieving something is absolutely right. A lot of the stuff Tim touched on as well, because Tim has been an advocate of professional training for people for years. Yeah, and actually it was another thing we were involved in at Nelson Trust, where I told you Nelson Trust is a residential treatment centre. I came back from Clouds and Guy's Hospital, and I said, right, you all have to train in postgrad diplomas and be accredited, qualified, and continue with your professional development as well. It wasn't enough just to reach that; you had to continue with it. Then what I changed was actually, I thought, it's not enough for them just to be addiction counsellors. I want people coming in, if you're going to say you're doing CBT, I want you to have a 2-year postgrad diploma in cognitive behavioural therapy. Yeah. If you're saying you're a CAAD practitioner, I want you to have 2 years, at least 2 years training in it. If you're calling yourself a psychotherapist, you have to have 4 years training in it. Yeah. If you're saying you're a person-centred counsellor, etc., etc., etc. And we got this team of counsellors, yeah, who were just amazing. Yeah, systemic family therapists, a lot. Yeah. But then, like everything else, they got a bit too big for their boots, in the sense where, all of a sudden, in a therapeutic environment, all of a sudden the counsellors are telling me, I'm sorry, it's not my job to check his bedroom, yeah, to see if it's clean. Yeah, you need to get somebody else to do that. So we did, but we had to get rid of all the counsellors first. We didn't, but what we did was we took the power away from the counsellors, in the sense that they didn't run the organisation. Yeah, okay, and we said, okay, you are employed as counsellors, and our clients will have to make appointments to see you, and they will have their 15-minute sessions with you, and you will take your notes at the end of it, and you will have your supervision if you do a certain number of hours, and you will continue with ongoing training, and you will report back in, to the team if there are recurring themes with this client that needs support, so you can keep your professional boundaries and your professional accreditation. And here we got forming the day-to-day alliance with the individuals were the key workers. Yeah, and they were trained up as well, and continue to be trained up. Yeah, where they're coming in and they're asking the client on assessment. It's a comprehensive assessment, and we agree. Here's what we have to offer you. Can you? This is the deal. Yeah, basically, if you do this, yeah, we'll do this, and we'll try and get you through to the end. Yeah, and then it's a reminder, you know, constantly all the way through. I wish I'd had time to talk about some of the stuff we're doing in the community because it's amazing. But I put those up to remind myself, you know, of that. You know, Philip was the anonymised name used for that child, you know, that had those experiences, you know, and you know, I know it could have been prevented, you know, and I know if we'd, it's not a guarantee, but it was avoidable, yeah. And I know if we'd been in a position where we could intervene early, yeah, he may not have been, you know, getting that, ticking all those boxes, yeah, and that was going to require looking at that woman and that mum and all her needs, including her family needs, and it meant that we need to take into account trauma and mental health, yeah. And if you're going to, you get these things bandied about. I remember when recovery came on. A lot of you probably know when recovery wasn't fashionable, yeah, and then it became fashionable. And when it became fashionable, everybody was calling themselves recovery organisations, yeah. Okay, they hadn't got a clue what recovery was, yeah. Okay, and I hear this bandied about now by around trauma, yeah. Okay, if you don't know what it is, don't just say you know what it is and then try and do trauma-informed training. Yeah, it's not just the knowledge of it. It's about an environment. It's about the relationships. It's about your policies and procedures. Yeah, and it's about the operational model that you deliver. Yeah, you're going to use it, do it properly, because our first duty is not to do any harm to people. Yeah, okay. It's to keep them safe. So, what was an outcome? I actually put this up to wind up Bob, but he's not here. Yeah, because he's usually very clear about what they are, and I say to him, actually, they mean different things to different people. Yeah, you know, we're inspected by CQC. You see David in the audience, an old inspector of ours, inspected by QC. But there's things we have to do for them. Yeah, the one thing I will say about that is that it's a fundamental belief of not just me, but the organisation I work for, is that if you get your governance right, you will get everything right. Yeah, you know, that's the starting point. Yeah, it has to be right. But we have, you know, outcomes we need to be achieved for certain people. We need to be able to say, yes, you know, here's what we do, here's how we do it. I need to report lots of reporting requirements into different things. You know, manualised treatments. You know, people who buy our services say, essentially what they say is, you know, the outcome that we want is for that client to complete treatment. Yeah, and for some of them to stay in the Cotswolds. Yeah. Yeah, for God's sake, don't send them back to London because the crime rate will shoot up again. You know, wherever it is they came from. And they're happy if they do that. Yeah, the crime rate stayed quite low in Gloucestershire as well, so we're doing all right. But I think it's a good point, you know, because again, going back to that thing about the artist, it's, you know, you really got to ask your client. You know, you call them clients, patients, service users, wherever it is. You know, how are we doing? Yeah, is this working for you? Yeah. When I get the opportunity to talk to clients before they leave, I say to them, what was it like here? And they'll want to tell me what was great about it. Yeah. And I love it when they tell me, you know, oh, you know, Beth was great, or, you know, Helen was great, or Kirsten was great. You know, really love working with them. I say to them, that's good because that's what we paid them for. But what did you not like? Yeah. What didn't work for you? Is there anything that we could have done different? And I'll say to them, and the reason for this is, if you tell me now what we could do better, that's going to make a difference to the guy who's coming in next. Yeah, and it's very important to learn it. Yeah, there used to be a time if a client came back and said, I don't like that counsellor, or I don't like that wherever it is, right? Well, then it was tough shit. Yeah, because we're not going to embarrass the counsellor by changing them. Yeah, you know, and they can't. Their ego can't handle that. You know, they're too fragile. Yeah, what? You know, so what's the guy going to do? Put up with an arsehole? You know, it's somebody who he thinks is. You know, for the next 12 or 24 weeks, yeah? I mean, I'm not saying the individual was, you know, but we all know that for some inexplicable reasons that people we don't get on with, yeah? You know, why put somebody through that? Yeah? Why put them through it? What's going to work for you? What's going to make a difference for you? Yeah? Probably a summary of what I've just said, actually, it's important to listen to what individuals consider important, respecting their priorities and preferences. They will tell you if you listen hard enough. Yeah, that's probably one of the difficult things about our job, isn't it? You know, is listening. You know, a good life is a journey, not a single vision. Recovery is a process, a journey that may have many setbacks and difficulties. And you know, these are the things that people tell me make a difference. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
really rich presentation, thanks, informed by sort of you and what you do. I really got a sense of how committed you are to this, and your humour actually as well, which is really, really good. Not too serious about it, because it's really important. I guess what we're trying to do is open life up to people, not shut it down. So our style is important, I think. The thing that I went about, the thing that I'm really passionate about is this whole issue about boundaries and sort of boundary crossings versus boundary violations, and the misunderstanding of that in our field, and how boundary holding becomes a way of sitting in a silo and throwing things at people and saying, maybe it's saying I'm too good for that, or maybe it's saying something, maybe it's saying I'm afraid I don't really understand my field, I think often. And that was the thing that really struck me, that we are maybe, and this is maybe the pressure for outcomes and controlling situations and being able to measure what's going on, that we're moving to maybe a situation where we can't be comfortable about crossing a boundary with a client because it's therapeutic to do it. So, for example, me leaving my office and going to a meeting with somebody is clearly a boundary crossing, but that's at times, I think, very therapeutic for that relationship and important for that client. And me actually sharing as somebody in recovery in that meeting, and I'm thoughtful about what I share and I hold the boundaries. And again, that may be very therapeutic in that relationship for that client. So that really struck me, so I'm glad you brought that up. And all the other stuff around took me back to my days working in social services and doing these serious case reviews. And it's a failure of the system. It is always a failure of the system. And how many case reviews do we need to hear that says the system failed before really we take that seriously and start looking at the system? So those are a couple of things that really, got me. I think it was really rich. Any other thoughts or questions from here, specifically to John, and then we're going to open it up to everybody, sort of questions about all the presentations. Yes, please. Thanks.
Good. Thank
What's
you.
your name?
Andrew Sidoli.
Hi, Andrew.
Clinical director of a facility in the States. So, my observation is that we're not very clear about what outcomes are, in the sense that, it tends to be the agency or the field in itself that sort of defines what the parameters of successful outcomes, and we're not really quite sort of in agreement about that. But I'm wondering how much we actually ask the patients what they consider a successful outcome. So our outcomes are predicated by sort of reimbursements and sort of effectiveness and evidence-based practices, and all that drives that. But I think our patients' idea of what a successful outcome is actually very, very different.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So the question is about do we know what an outcome is, and sort of I think it's more of a panel question. I think. Do you want to jump in first, John, or do you want to, Tim? You want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't mind just briefly, because there is a paper that I would really recommend people to look at. It's by Edwards and Loeb, two women who are working in Edinburgh. And it is a qualitative study done by the practitioners themselves about a counselling service that essentially was offering client-centred counselling to very disadvantaged, chaotic, alcohol and drug dependent people in Edinburgh. And that all the standard outcomes weren't really achieved. I mean, if you certainly wanted to see the service as something that was going to stop people using drugs or was going to produce the sort of politically desirable outcomes, they weren't really there. But the qualitative study revealed that each one of the clients made enormous changes. And they made enormous changes in their relationships. Even just the experience of having a good relationship with a counsellor produced some changes which those people were able to tell the researchers about. It's Edwards and Loeb, and it says what difference does counselling make? And it's a fantastic paper. It's easy, it's readable, and it's really interesting on this issue of client-centred outcomes, what really matters to people. So I just wanted to point that out and read that, please.
Thanks, Tim. Abby, do you want to come in on that one?
And I suppose just to say that it's a spectrum, isn't it? So at one end there's there are tools, there are nationally agreed outcome measures, as you were talking about using your work as well, which we've used, which are really helpful. But also there are outcomes that people who are using services want to get from the work that they're doing. So there's one that really sticks in my mind was we did a piece of work, looked at all the big usual outcomes, but when we asked our clients what was the thing that really made a difference to them, it was that they had started eating their meals together as a family. And it really that really resonated with me, because that's something you might not ask about. You might not think that's a major kind of national inquiry about whether you do that, but for that group of people, that made a really big difference. So I think it's a spectrum.
I think breaking the cycle.
It is the breaking the cycle. Yeah. So I think it's a spectrum. There's the hard measures and the kind of nationally agreed outcomes, but then there are definitely those outcomes that matter to people.
I think one of the things Tim mentioned earlier was the lack of resources in our field. We all know what we'd like to do, but in truth we haven't got the resources to do them. So there is a game that we have to play. When we're doing this, and I'll give you an example of one. I could be talking to a commissioner. I actually learned this a long time ago. It was at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. I trapped this commissioner in my office for about 2 hours. I wouldn't let him out until he'd heard me. And at the end of it, he said to me, "John, when you talk like that," he said, "I just switch off." And I'd been waxing lyrical about recovery and about how important it is and the difference it makes, and you wouldn't believe, the outcomes that people get. And I said to him, so what do you want, right? And he told me what he wanted. So I thought, well, actually, I think our clients can do that. So today I'm talking to commissioners who say to me, look, if you could just stop them going to A&E every week. Or 3 times a day. And I said, "How much will you give me?" "Right, well, we'll give you 50,000 a year if you can do something." Right? That's great. I'm nowhere near A&E. And really, what the business that we're in, is the business of behaviour modification. If we can get people to change that, we can engage with them, and as Abby was saying, there will be things that are important to them that will make a difference. And it's a shame that we have to play that game in the UK, but we do.
And I also, I wonder something about the attachment to mystification that happens in the field as well. Not telling people what you're doing leads to this issue about trying to confuse the outcomes, because outcomes can be scary for practitioners because then you measure. And measuring can have a lot of fear associated with it. It doesn't need to be. I think it's okay.
Well, I think this is your point about the idea that there's a fantasy that we can do a complete psychotherapy on someone in a few weeks or months. Is a function of not having the goals that are achievable. You need to know which steps are possible in the first step, and you help the person make those steps. The journey of recovery, or whatever you like to call it, is a long one, and is very different for each person. So we can only do what we can. We need to be nudging people in a skillful way just to make that.
And there's another point as well. I'm really struck by all 3 of you about. There's something about how you're advocates for outcomes that are appropriate. And there's a role there, isn't there, about advocating for what is an appropriate outcome, and what should we be measuring and why are we measuring it. And ultimately it's about improvements in somebody's life, somebody's family's life, or that child who's still in my mind, that 3-year-old who has 1,000+ more chance of recreating the cycle, and thinking about that as well and advocating for that. And there's something there, I think, about the work is, maybe it's sort of, addiction is hidden away somewhere, but actually it's mainstream what we do. It's crucially mainstream, and we need to sort of step into that, because I think we have a lot to say around those issues. Any other questions or thoughts from the floor? We're in this sort of panel session, so things that struck you.
Comment.
Can I give you a mic, just for the camera? Thanks so much.
The ritual stick.
Martin Judson, I'm an addictionist from Ontario.
Hi.
Hello. I've been dealing with addicts for about 40 years, and it came home to me about 5 years ago when a patient came in to see me, and I asked her why they'd come to see me, and their statement was, because I've been to so many places and nothing works. And I said, that's absolutely right. Nothing does work. You have to do the work.
Yes.
And I'm always concerned when I see all these adverts upstairs for these treatment programs that advocate this and that. And it's the old adage that empty barrels make the most sound. And it's not the treatment programs that's providing this service. All it is providing the opportunity for the patient to make some changes. But we, as counsellors, therapists, physicians, whatever we want to call ourselves, we mustn't underestimate that what we're really doing is just holding their hands and letting them know that they don't need to be frightened. There is hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel. And if they have the courage to change, they will succeed.
So,
can I just respond to that? I completely agree with it. I think it's our programs offer people resources, and they can take those resources up or not. And our job, I think, is to help them see how those resources can be used. And as you say, it's what they do and how they change that's important. We don't have a technology to make people recover. Yeah, I mean that's pretty much my response.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Abby, John, do you want to come in on that point? Thinking about very person-centred approaches.
Yes. I mean, other than that, I completely agree with you. It's if we listen to our clients, they will tell us what they need. Yeah, okay. And I think our job, I haven't got it to give it to them. Yeah, but I do see it as being part of my job to help them find it in themselves. Yeah.
Exactly.
And similarly, when they talk, I often find that they haven't quite learned to listen to themselves. Yeah, and if they do that, they hear what needs to be done. Yeah, and I would say actually, I'd say the therapeutic alliance is probably the most critical thing. It's what I've heard for the last 20 years. They'll come back and they'll be, this person said this and did that, whether it was in the car park or they might even say to me, I've had people come back to me and say to me, when you told me, and they'll quote something, and I'm standing there thinking, did I say that? Yeah, what, and all the pearls of wisdom that I thought I told them, just didn't land. Yeah, so I completely agree with it. Yeah.
What Abigail said was absolutely right. Treatment is negotiation.
Yeah.
Once as the counsellor, you're the facilitator of this negotiation. You've got to offer all the possibilities, all the modalities of treatment, but it's up to the client to decide, be eclectic. What will they take? They then compartmentalize it into their program of recovery, and because they're in it, they're starring in it, they're directing it, it's bound to be a blockbuster.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any thoughts from Abby or John on that? No? Any other questions or thoughts from the floor? Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Just tell us your name if you don't mind.
Hi, Erica Rourke from Dublin.
Hello, Erica.
Hi. Just picking up on the last speaker there's a very nice research paper that some people might be familiar with by Miller and Moyes that does a meta-analysis and essentially tells the fairly obvious thing that the common factors are the most significant variables of change in addiction treatment, and that actually the differences between various so-called evidence-based practices are so slim as to be clinically insignificant. And just the other thing in terms of client outcomes, there's a very nice paper that I came across again by I think it's a Joanne Neal, which looks at a patient-reported outcome measure called something like the SURE, Service User Recovery Evaluation, but is based on qualitative studies of what for our clients really captures recovery. And it's just a really nice, simple little outcome measure.
Thanks. So we're just coming to the end. One or two points you want to make on that each, and maybe one or two points you want to make to sort of wrap up.
Well, I mean, I think the research you've talked about is very interesting, and I'm myself very interested in mechanisms of change. But and we're not redundant. I mean, the idea that everything is with the client and that we can't show them anything new or help them to reframe things is not correct. I mean, otherwise everybody would sail into recovery without our assistance. But our task is modest. It is to nudge people, to show people things, to connect people to resources. I mean, actually just practical social resources, connecting people to those has improved outcomes for very disadvantaged people in the States. And we forget that sometimes it's simple, to know that you can get a bus pass, or you can know you can get this childcare somewhere, is a significant thing, and maybe more significant than a piece of psychotherapy sometimes.
Yeah, thanks. Abby, any sort of thoughts?
I think I just wanted to pick up on what the last person was saying. I think you mentioned the qualitative research, and I think that is really important. And it's often quite expensive, and it takes time. And too often it's not possible to do that in a formal way. And I would definitely be an advocate for using that qualitative research, because it's giving the voice to the person who can tell you what their experience was.
Yeah. And Jo Neal and her colleagues has done some of the best qualitative research in the field. It's really good stuff. But yeah, we should be taking that seriously.
John, any thoughts?
Just, I mean, a recommendation for a reading be a lot of people have come across a book called The Heroic Client, Scott Miller, and it, Scott's argument is basically nothing works or nothing's better than anything else. Yeah, but don't lose sight of the role of the client in their own recovery, or their own treatment.
And also, it is true that the different models of intervention have very equivalent outcomes, same sort of effect sizes. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a model, that it doesn't matter. My mentor was a guy called Tony Ryle, who actually was the guy who set up the psychotherapy service in St Thomas's that ended up with the MSc at Guy's and that. And he said, the model is to hold the therapist. In some senses, if somebody was to ask me, which counsellor should I go and see, I would say, well, go and see somebody you like and whose way of working makes sense to you. As far as the practitioner is concerned, having a very clear model allows a framework. Tony also wrote a brilliant book called Frames and Cages, which showed you that kind of structures could either be a frame that you can climb on and that you can, or they could be a cage that traps you and limits you. And again, I think that's a very important sort of image. And we do need models. It's not like we can do without proper trainings, that we don't need to know how to do it properly, as you say, how to do things properly. But it is also true that if you're well-trained counsellor, it doesn't really matter whether you're cognitive behavioural or whether you're client-centred or whether you're deep custard therapy or whatever. As long as you've got a model that's very clear, then you're likely to be able to help people.
Thanks. Great. I think we're going to sort of wrap up there. Sorry? Yeah, we're time to finish. Okay, we could go on. I suppose sort of what strikes me is that I'm really inspired by the work that we're doing around the idea of evidence and engaging with clients to produce something that is meaningful. Sort of, if I think back to the early days in my practice when all this evidence stuff was coming in, it did seem like it was somebody else's agenda that had nothing to do with something that made sense to me, which was trying to help somebody in the best way I could improve their life in the way that they thought it improved, But now it does seem we're getting more sophisticated in what we're doing and able to sort of engage in a relationship. And I think it is about the relationship. And I exist as a person in relationship to my clients. And I have some opinions and thoughts about stuff when I'm sitting with them. And I'm not afraid to share that with them. And those opinions and thoughts are informed by the work that people like you are doing, which I would call evidence. And I don't mind that. I think that's really helpful to me. And it holds me in a model. And I can change models.
Yeah.
And I know which one I'm in. And that's fine. I navigate with that and then I go to the next one. So thanks for the work that you're doing and thanks for being here. It's really helpful to me. I hope that was useful. Please do come up and have a chat with folks afterwards. And thank you. Yeah, round of applause for the presenters.